wrap, disengaging the chain brake with our forefingers, engaging it with our wrist, right? So you got that option. You can either engage the chain brake if you're moving around with a chainsaw, or you can have the engine off. One of those two things. It is inappropriate to have the engine on and the chain brake disengaged if you are not actively cutting something. Currently in the ANSI standards, there's a 2-step rule. All right, so step 1, step 2, anything more than that, you have to engage your chain brake. It's highly likely that that rule is going to be changing to any type of movement where you would pick up your feet in the next 2022 revision cycle. So the new standard is likely to be more restrictive in your movement, with the understanding that if you're not cutting on something, just make sure the chain brake is engaged. Okay, we talked about the chain brake as a function of fatigue on the saw as an apparatus. The chain brake itself, the bearings on the drive shaft. Slow the chain down if at all possible before you engage the chain brake, and that's going to elongate the life of that chain brake. So those first 2 items is just talking about anytime you're not actively cutting on something. Option 1, engage the chain brake. Option 1, engage the chain brake. Option 2, shut off the saw. Another ANSI standard is how to walk or maneuver with the chainsaw. We want to walk and maneuver with a chainsaw in an ergonomic fashion, which means keeping it as close to our body as possible, utilizing the least amount of energy so that you can focus that energy on other tasks like climbing or tree felling. So if you're going to be carrying a saw one-handed, it should be carried on your side. With the power head as close to your body as possible, keeping it out and away from your body is going to take more effort than keeping it close to you, okay? Whether it's forwards or backwards, I don't know if you can see that, whether the saw is being carried forwards or backwards, there's no ruling on that. It's whatever the situation may be, it can be adapted to your own personal preferences and the terrain that you're working in. Downhill terrain or uphill terrain, the likelihood of which direction are you going to slip. If you think you're going to slip backwards, point the bar forwards. If you think you're going to slip forwards, point the bar backwards, right? The goal is to not come in contact with the hot muffler or the sharp chain or the spikes in the front of the chainsaw as well. The next 22 revisions, the spikes are also going to be noted as the hazard that we want to try to avoid anytime you're maneuvering with a chainsaw. One-handed, forwards, backwards, doesn't matter. My personal preference when walking with a chainsaw, the most ergonomic position is using both hands, equally distributing the weight across your body. Use 2 hands on the saw. Keep the power head nice and close to you, rested into your hips. And this is the most powerful way to carry a chainsaw. It gives you a lot more ability to maneuver it and balance with it in case you land on uneven territory or you slip down a slope. So 2 hands on the chainsaw is my preferred method, but keeping it close to your body, right? It's interesting that there's a 2-step rule about having the saw shut off or the chain brake engaged, or when you're not actively cutting on something, but it never actually explicitly states in our ANSI standards when that has to be engaged when you're working aloft. So whether you're climbing or whether you're operating in a basket, that rule again is going to become more restrictive in the very near future. Currently there isn't a rule, but for our own company, it makes sense that we would want to apply that same logic, right? If you're not actively cutting on something, whether you're climbing, whether you're in a bucket, whether you're in a lift, whatever it may be, make sure either the chain brake is on or the engine is shut off. When you are climbing, all tools have to be secured against the fall, right? There's people underneath you, there's a drop zone, even if you're not necessarily dropping anything like cabling, you still want to make sure that you don't intentionally or you have a mechanism in place to prevent things accidentally falling out of the tree. We have available to anybody who's working aloft, especially climbers, to use a lanyard. These lanyards that we give you should be noted that they're breakaway lanyards. Not all lanyards are created the same. These particular breakaway lanyards are designed to actually release the saw from the lanyard should a force, I think greater than 500 pounds or something like that, be applied to it. In the case that your saw were to get stuck in the kerf of a log that you were cutting, we don't want you with the saw attached to your harness being pulled with the log if it gets caught. So that's the reason for these breakaway lanyards. And that's the reason that we buy them. I'm sorry. 15 pounds is the max weight. I don't know what the break weight is of these, but it will work. It will separate if you get caught and your saw has with the idea that the saw is replaceable. You are not. So if you're ever working a lot, make sure that you secure your tools. And that applies for all tools, not just chainsaws. Your drill, your cabling equipment, whatever it is, it shouldn't just be fumbled around in your hands. Should you have to unclip a device, whether it's a saw or a drill or whatever it is, it's helpful to communicate to the people who are working underneath you. Again, communication is key. It's not a requirement, but it does make some sense to let people know. And just by yelling down loose gear, and then response, all clear, I acknowledge what you said. With our comm systems, we're probably talking at a more calm volume. But just letting people know, hey, there's a possibility now. It's unclipped for me as I reposition it to my other side. If I get stung by a bee or I just fumble it, whatever, who knows, it could fall out. Just stay clear of anything underneath me during that time period. So letting your crew members know that you have loose gear aloft is a great way to help prevent injury as well. So again, same rules apply. When you are operating out of a bucket or a lift, now that every crew has some piece of aerial equipment, when you're not using the chainsaw, when you're not actively cutting with the saw, we want to make sure that the chain brake is engaged and or the engine shut off and it's stowed in a scabbard. The reason it needs to be stowed in the scabbard is it's designed to keep the hot parts away from your body and the sharp parts away from your body, similar to how we walk and maneuver with a saw. You're in a tight, confined space in those lifts and in the bucket, and there's a lot of burn marks on ankles and cut up shoes and pants from bars sliding against them. It also increases the likelihood that you might accidentally knock the saw out of the bottom of the basket, right? So we do have scabbards for all of our lift equipment. If yours needs to be replaced, I believe we have a few extra. Please do make sure that you ask. And before you grab the last one, let us know so that we can make more for the rest of the company, right? They are wear items. They're expected to fail eventually. So let's get them replaced before they fail, but use them for their full intended life. One thing that's going to help with that, including one of these last, the last item on here as well, is when we put the scabbard onto the saw, or whether we put the saw into the scabbard, if the engine is shut off and you disengage the chain brake, it's going to allow the scabbard to move the chain as it slides on, which is going to reduce the amount of cutting of the item that happens. So before you slide it into your scabbard in your lift, or put your scabbard on your saw for stowing it in the box of a truck, have the engine shut off, disengage the chain brake, let the chain roll as needed, and that's going to increase the longevity of both your scabbard and your saw scabbard for putting it away. When you put a saw away, when you stow it, think about it, the bar and the muffler still may be hot. Keep those hot items away from anything in the vehicle you don't want to get hot. Climbing ropes, rigging ropes, your personal equipment. Make sure that muffler stays away from everything. The scabbard is on, so we're not cutting things. We've talked about this in the past. Scabbards are cheap. They're like $5 a piece. If you don't have one, get one. Anytime the saw is not being used and after the bar has cooled down, you should slide that scabbard back on so somebody doesn't get cut. I got cut, I think it was 2 years ago now. There was a power pole saw sticking out the back of a truck with no scabbard on it. I didn't see it. I walked underneath it and whacked it. We had a safety meeting on it the next day. So put scabbards on your saw. It'll protect your equipment. It'll protect you and keep it away from hot items. So that's the foundation of this maneuvering with a chainsaw concept that we want you to work through in your books. Not a whole lot involved, just using the saw and keeping track of it in a safe and reasonable fashion. Any questions on that? pretty simple, straightforward stuff, eh? I thought so too. I didn't know we were recording.